Hello everyone, it is a very great privilege to be here, yes, to have gone from being a non-young earth creationist to believing the Bible from the very first verse. And tonight I'd really like to talk about something that's a personal interest of mine, the world of plants. And let's start off by reading Genesis chapter 1, the account of the creation of plants. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the third day. Now, if you just take that as read and then go out and look at the evidence around the world, you'd have to say that God's been very effective in creating plants that have indeed covered the whole world. High mountains, valleys, seaside, even in the water at the seaside. In cold environments, very frosty places, plants are able to hang on there and persist to vegetate the areas. Even in places with snow, you can find plants. In dry areas, sandy areas where low rainfall and not much water hangs around in the soil. In fact, we had an article recently in Creation magazine about some plants that live in a very dry environment. You can just see the little flat-topped windows in the leaves. Most of the leaves are actually under the ground. These are called window plants. And what happens is when the rains come, the roots swell and they push the leaves up above the ground. But as the rains recede, the ground dries out, the root pulls the leaf back into the ground until there's just a little window to minimise water loss. And so you get sunlight shining in through the tips of the leaves, through these little windows, into the chloroplasts, which do their photosynthetic work inside. Plants have indeed colonised the whole world. Very wet areas. I lived in Indonesia for a time, and of course rice loves growing in water. You find plants growing in swampy areas and at the water's edge, and even in the water. Salvinia can cover whole lakes in double-quick time. Plants can even hang on in very windy areas. You'd think that when you go into a cyclone-ravaged area where there's no leaves left on the trees, that's it. But within a couple of years, the trees are bouncing back. They come in all different shapes and sizes. Short ones, tall ones, palm-shaped ones, tall grasses, very tall grasses, bamboo. And they come in all different colours too. I probably don't need to talk much about that if you're a keen gardener. We see them in all environments, and they change with the seasons. Come autumn, they begin to lose the green in their leaves, and in cold places, they shed their leaves for the winter. It's a very smart thing to do. And then come spring, what happens? Out come the blossoms, and indeed, what do we find? God has indeed programmed the plants very effectively to reproduce according to their kind. We find them everywhere. We admire them in all their various different colours and shapes. And here's my favourite, we eat them. I love eating them. That's why I did horticultural science at university. I really wanted an excuse just to get more fruit to eat. And later on, after I got my PhD, I went up to North Queensland and worked as a mango researcher in the Department of Primary Industries for 5 years. So my family and I had plenty of mangoes, that's for sure. Look, they are really beautiful, aren't they? Most people I know have some fruit favourite that they love eating. The longan is a particular favourite of mine, as are lychees. I'm not sure if you can get them here, but we have an abundance of them in southeast Queensland. Fruits of all different colours and shapes, so we admire them, we admire plants, and we eat them. We also wear them. Many of you in summer would be wearing garments made of 100% cotton, and of course linen comes from flax. And we build things out of them. You might remember this recent article in Creation magazine. A Dutch fellow has built a working model of Noah's Ark. This one here looks big, but in fact it's nowhere near the size of the real ark. That's his next project, to build an ark the size that Noah built it so he can take it down in the ocean. He deliberately downsized this ark so it could fit through the canals in Holland, and the people line the canals coming out looking at it, and he uses it as a witnessing tool. We build things out of it. We burn plants for warmth, for heating. We run on them. When I was younger, I liked to climb them. And I used to go snorkeling and spearfishing, so I used to swim over them, the seagrass pastures of St Vincent's Gulf in South Australia. And then later on, when I went to uni, I went on to study them. And my PhD project was to look at the tree legumes at a field site in Indonesia. I was enrolled at an Australian university, the University of New England, but I did my field research in Indonesia, which was quite an experience. And basically, I was looking at the nitrogen economy of a system where they cut the tree legume and give it to the animal. And so I was tracking the path of nitrogen from these tree legumes, because tree legumes, like your backyard beans or peas, can actually take nitrogen from the air and incorporate into their tissues. That's why they're so high in nitrogen. So it's a wonderful thing. You don't actually need to add nitrogen to the soil to grow these legumes. And so growing legumes is a great way of getting nitrogen for free. You don't have to buy nitrogen fertiliser. And so that's what I was looking at. One of the 4 tree legume species that I was looking at was called Leucaena. Some of you might know Leucaena. It was renowned for causing the cattle in Australia to become very sick. Because of the toxins in them. But in fact, cattle in Indonesia and Hawaii can eat the Leucaena without getting sick. And there's a CSIRO scientist, he's retired now, but he became very famous because he worked out how to solve the problem in Australia. He went to Hawaii, despite the fact his colleagues said, "You're nuts thinking that the rumen bacteria will be different there from the ones we've got." Well, he showed that they were wrong, and it was worth a lot of money to the Australian cattle industry. And he's actually a Christian, Dr. Raymond Jones. You might remember reading the interview in Creation magazine. And he says, the animal needs the microbes and the bugs need the animal. It's a good example of design. So you can tell that he's a creationist. That was a few years ago now in Creation magazine. If you like reading the back issues of the magazine, we've run out of those a long time ago. But on our website, you can go back and read the articles in Creation magazine over 1 year old. A tremendous amount of valuable resource material there. Anyway, from my perspective as a PhD student, I was looking at these nitrogen transfer relationships, and mostly my PhD went okay. I had quite a few obstacles, but thankfully by the end of the research I had to do, things were working well. Here we've got an example, just a little sub-sample of the sort of things I did. I took leaf from, in this case, the Gliricidia and Leucaena tree legume, and mixed it up in the soil in pots for grass to grow in to see, how much nitrogen was being transferred. And there you can see the control plant that had no added leaf material or feces or urine that came from being passed through an animal. That was fun. And you can see that the response, you dig in the soil, adding extra leaf or feces or urine that has come from the animals that have eaten the tree legume leaf, and you get a response. So that was all very well. My job title when I later joined Department of Primary Industries was plant physiologist. So I suppose you could say I was looking at the physiology of plants. Sometimes when I go out to churches, the well-meaning pastors introduce me as a plant psychologist. I have to say that at no stage did I ever feel like, did I ever go ahead and talk to the plants? That's for crazy people to do. But now as a Christian, I find that Jesus himself talked to the plants. But unlike any of us, Jesus got a response. There were times when I felt like telling my plants that they should be uprooted and jumped in the sea. But anyway, to cut a long story short, got through the PhD okay. But I've got to share with you that I've got a very different perspective now than what I had when I started out on my PhD. I used to actually have a double standard when it came to the work I did. You see, I had this view that it's a dog-eat-dog struggle for survival, only the fittest survive. And so when it came to ornamentals, things that might be pleasing to some people's eye, they weren't really pleasing to my eye. I only wanted stuff you could eat, or pasture you could feed animals, which you could then eat. So I used to think, why do we go to the trouble of fertilising things? So I used to think about these things, and later on when I became a Christian and read through the Bible and read the account of the parable of the fig tree, the unfruitful fig tree, and let's cut it down. Why should it use up all the soil? And the man says, no, leave it alone for 1 more year. I'll dig around it and fertilise it, and if it bears next year, fine. If not, cut it down. Now, that is understood worldwide. You want your plants to grow well, you dig around them, aerate the soil, mix in a bit of fertiliser, manure, if you can get it, and your plants grow better. But like I say, even I had this double standard. Even though I was happy to practice it, I still couldn't quite work out how it all fit in the scheme of things. And studying horticulture, I had similar sort of thoughts regarding pruning. Now, pruning is quite a contentious subject amongst horticulturists. Everyone has an idea of how it should be done, but everyone agrees that to get commercially marketable fruit in good supply, you really do have to prune. And the way you prune depends on the crop you have. So, for example, apples produce fruit mainly on terminals of short twigs, or the spurs, that are on 2-year-old or older wood. So that means when you're pruning, you've got to make sure that you leave behind, if you want to get regular crops, you've got to leave behind some 2-year-old or older wood. And that can be quite tricky. And generally the rule is, when pruning apples, you take no more than about 15% of last year's growth. It's similar to for pears, but for things like peaches, it's very different. Peaches primarily set fruit on 1-year-old wood. So you therefore need to prune so that you make sure you've got your constant supply of 1-year-old wood. In fact, I remember one of my lecturers telling us that with peaches you need to open up the tree. He said you should prune it to open it up so that you can throw a cat through the middle without him grabbing hold of the limbs. And my horticulture student friend next to me said, wow, there you are, cats are useful for something after all. I think if he'd been on the ark, if he'd been on board the ark, the cats would have been overboard, don't you? With grapes, grapes produce buds from 1-year-old canes, and with grapes, basically you can be ruthless. You've got to remove 90% of last year's growth. So as an agricultural science student, a horticultural science student, who was thoroughly atheistic, I believed evolution, I used to ponder these things. How did come these plants respond so fruitfully to pruning? How did they ever evolve? And I couldn't really get anywhere with it. But as I say, now that I'm a Christian, everybody accepts you want fruitfulness, you've got to prune. Well, look what Jesus said here. I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes so that we'll be even more fruitful. Jesus' disciples would have understood the practical reality of that in terms of applying to their agricultural world. And anyway, I now understand that the reason that trees are more fruitful when they're being pruned is that they were designed that way. Let's have a look at this. The Lord God took the man, this is back in Genesis chapter 2, the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. Now, what does that mean? What would Adam have done? It's possible he might have dug around each tree to fertilise it, to help it grow, but I think that he would have had to have done quite a bit of pruning. And maybe that was part of his work. Let's read on in this passage, seeing we've got it here. The Lord God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will surely die. Very famous passage. And later on, what happened? Along came the serpent and tried to entice the woman to eat it. And the serpent said, did God really say you weren't to eat from any tree in the garden? And the woman said, oh no, we may eat fruit from trees in the garden, but God said, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. Now wait a minute, what was Adam's job in the garden? I think, to prune it. You can't prune a tree unless you touch it. So, that's very interesting, isn't it? Anyway, I now have a completely different perspective on agriculture and horticulture. Trees were basically designed to be pruned and also to be eaten. We read in Psalm 104, the Lord makes grass to grow for the cattle and plants for man to cultivate, bringing forth food from the earth, wine that gladdens the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread that sustains his heart. Now, isn't it amazing? Another one of Jesus' parables, Jesus again used something that was very familiar to the disciples. You plant one grain of seed and you get much more than that back, don't you? Four row wheat grains and so on. From one mango seed in North Queensland, if you waited long enough for it to fruit, you get hundreds of fruit off it. You plant a seed and you get 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. What a great wealth creation strategy, just from solar energy. I wonder who designed that system. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. That was for us to eat. That's what they were designed for. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds of the air and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. And so you look around today and the reality is plants are capable of being crunched and munched and browsed and grazed and pruned. Birds make their nests out of trees. Incredible what some of the plants that birds can live in and that they eat. Now, it's very interesting, though, because today you find some creatures that don't eat plants anymore, or don't eat plants all the time. Would you believe there's even a little finch on the Galapagos Islands, which it was known as a seed-eating finch, but do you know when times are tough and the rain hasn't fallen for a while and seeds in short supply, as this article in Creation magazine, some of you might remember it, showed, these finches have learned that they can go up behind booby birds sitting on their nest and worry the skin between the feathers to the point that it bleeds, and then they suck the blood. Isn't that amazing? And if you look closely there, you'll actually see a couple of finches on the back of the booby bird there lining up, as if lining up at a blood bank, and there's a couple more actually waiting on the rocks there to queue up. Now that's interesting. So here you've got one example of birds that have clearly gone from seed eating to a form of carnivory, blood sucking. And so we find lots of examples of that. We also find echoes of Eden. We had a couple of articles in Creation magazine and in the last decade or so about lions that throughout their time did not eat meat. We had a more recent article about a lioness was raised in Italy in a very poor zoo, and the zoo couldn't afford to keep it, so a local guy said, oh, well, I'll feed it, but he wasn't rich either. Anyway, Leah basically enjoyed spaghetti with Neapolitan sauce. So for the first 7 years of her life, she was vegetarian. So what does this mean? It means we've got examples of vegetarians becoming carnivorous. Even sheep and cattle have been documented chasing down the odd bird and eating it. And you've got examples of things that we think of as being carnivores, but which are vegetarian. In fact, some of the carnivores, things that are classed as class carnivora on the basis of their teeth, actually never eat meat. So from an evolutionary perspective, I don't know how you'd explain that, but from a biblical perspective, it makes complete sense to me. Originally, we were all vegetarian, all the animals too. And the thing about with the plants is they were designed to be eaten. Here's a very interesting thing. This is from a back page article we had a few years ago. In the picture there are a number of baby bats sheltering in the nest their mother has made them. It's under a banana leaf. And what their mother has done is chew through the midrib of the banana leaf, not all the way through, but just enough to fold the banana leaf nicely over her offspring. Why didn't she chew all the way through? Well, we can see the result here. The plant is still alive. Now, here's the confronting thing for evolutionary theory. how do you, through evolution, get something so over-engineered that 97% of the water-conducting tissues can be chomped through and yet you'll still get water and nutrients going through? You know what one evolutionist said? It must have benefited the plant because with the leaves folded down like that, it was less prone to wind damage. You know, when we're discussing the water-conducting cells, it's been a big issue among plant scientists. How do plants get water and nutrients from the roots all the way up to the top of the tree? With many plants, scientists can understand it because they're only short. But what about things like Victoria's mountain ash tree and the Californian redwood, more than 100 metres high? And, you know, the physicists had trouble explaining this. How do you get a water column that high? And even the plant, if somehow sometimes you get a break in the water column, well, that's not a disaster for the plants. Often they can fix that embolism. How does that work? And it's only recently that they've begun to make some breakthroughs in that. In fact, a recent article in New Scientist, referring to another scientific journal, where some scientists have been able to duplicate the water-conducting tissues of the plant to the extent that they're now hopeful of building artificial structures to suck water out of the ground in waterlogged areas and things like that. And the secret that the breakthrough for them was working out how to duplicate the membrane that you find between the cells in the plant conducting tissues, because you've got to be able to let water through but not air. How do you do that? Well, they've managed to duplicate the membrane. So here's something to think about. If scientists have put all that effort into designing something that's capable of doing that, but we see that happen all the time in trees, doesn't that mean that maybe trees must have had a designer too? You know, there's lots of examples in the plant world of obvious design. And, you know, those things that we see in the plant world have often been copied by inventors. You said, hey, there's a good idea. One of the most famous ones, I'm sure you've heard of this one. This poor person here has got a lot of burrs stuck in their shoes and socks. Now, can anyone... Well done indeed, that's exactly right. Some guy went for a bit of a bushwalk and a whole lot of burrs got stuck in his trousers, and he looked at them and said, hey, look at that, little hooks there, exactly matching the loops in the fabric of my trousers. So he did a bit of experimentation and eventually came up with a fibre, and today we know it as Velcro, and you find it on your sandals, on wetsuit garments. Lots of garments have it. But where did the idea come from? The idea came from God. So next time you take, you open the Velcro on your sandals or whatever, I want you to think this, if you wouldn't mind. Wow, Velcro. This was an idea inspired by burrs. Burrs that were God's idea. What a rip-off. In the leaves, you find that the veins that transport the water, because the water goes up from the roots, up through the conducting tissues, up into the leaves, and then it evaporates from the leaves, and that is partly responsible for driving that water column up through the plant. Some engineers recently were trying to build an artificial capillary medium, and they used their maths to work out what's the very best pattern for branching of our capillaries. And you know what? They came up with exactly what you find in plants. They say plants could not have been any better engineered even if they'd been engineered. Similarly, with the design of the tree canopies, the fractal geometry between the branches was recently calculated to be absolutely perfect for covering the entire canopy area, the canopy volume, with the least possible inefficiency. You know, we find some very interesting things when we look at these conducting tissues. They're actually different sorts of conducting tissues in gymnosperms, that's the conifers, you know, plants that have cones like pine trees and so on, compared with the flowering plants, the angiosperms. And this puzzled some quite a few researchers looking into this because they said, look, the angiosperms are much more highly evolved than the gymnosperms. So the gymnosperms must have a very primitive water conducting mechanism. Well, they've recently done tests with conifers' water conducting mechanism, and they say, this is absolutely brilliant for cold environments and environments with slightly lower rainfall, because when you do get an embolism, a break in the water column, because of the design of the water conducting tissues, the gymnosperms can fix it really easily, while the angiosperms can live in much wetter environments, and in fact their water conducting tissues are ideally designed for that environment. So what's that telling us? It tells us that it's horses for courses. Plants were indeed designed to inhabit the whole earth. I've got a PhD in plant science, and I now believe in creation, so don't let anyone tell you that there aren't any PhD scientists who don't believe the Bible. There are numerous of us. Dr. Joe Harville is a plant scientist in Western Australia, and he's done studies comparing gymnosperms and angiosperms, and he said, look, they compete with one another perfectly well. There's no inferiority in the gymnosperms whatsoever. They are not inferior. One of the classic trademarks of plants is, of course, photosynthesis, the ability to capture the sun's energy and convert it into useful fuel. So basically, from carbon dioxide and water, you have to split the water molecule, you get sugars, carbohydrate, and it releases oxygen. What a great system that is, that we can breathe out carbon dioxide, and here are the plants pumping out oxygen just for our use. I wonder who designed that system. When you look at the chemistry into photosynthesis, although that basic reaction has long been known, they're still discovering layer upon layer upon layer of complexity that they hadn't really expected to find. And they're trying to duplicate that complexity. And it's interesting, 10 years ago, there was an article in New Scientist that looked at some scientists who were trying to duplicate that reaction of splitting the water molecule. The oxygen is released by splitting water molecules, a reaction that in the lab requires such violence that it would tear any living system apart. So how can plants do it using only energy from the sun? And there are a couple of researchers there, and they said, look, try breaking water apart in one go, and you'd need a huge blast of energy. To do the job with heat alone, for example, you'd need to raise the temperature of water by thousands of degrees, more than enough to vaporise a geranium. Well, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen trees exploding lately, so obviously they've got some secret as to how they do it. And so these two scientists tried to duplicate that, and they celebrated some success. And New Scientist said, look, most importantly, these researchers have shown that their chemistry complex is reasonably long-lasting. It's not destroyed every time a molecule of oxygen is formed. Wow, that's good. How much better is it than that? Oh, they can produce 100 molecules of oxygen before it was destroyed. Obviously, they've got a long way to go before they can attain what God designed. And they're still trying to chase up this thing, as that article admitted 10 years ago. Look, this is one of the drawbacks of the artificial system. It can't constantly regenerate itself. But of course, trees can repair themselves, can't they? Do you know a recent article reported from a number of laboratories around the world? It's a decade later, you'd think they'd made some progress. Well, here's a little quote I'll read to you. Practical artificial photosynthetic systems are still at least 10 years away. There are many technical problems to be solved to equal the efficiency of nature's way. And this particular researcher said, ask me again in 10 years, and I'll probably say we need another 10 years. What does this mean? Well, Romans chapter 1 verse 20, the Apostle Paul summed it up. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. And those of you who've been getting Creation magazine over the last few years, you'll see a number of updates on the whole photosynthesis investigation. recently they found that plants actually have a dimmer switch. So that if the sunlight gets too bright, they can actually tone it down. How does that work? You know, you could actually use this in your witnessing. And, one of my favourite examples, some of you have heard this before, if I'm walking through the park with an atheist friend of mine and I happen to see that someone's made a bird box and put it in a tree, you know, somewhere where you can put seeds to admire birds coming to feed at close range, I would say, oh, look at that bird box, I wonder where that came from. Of course, my atheist friend might say, somebody made it, you dodo. I would say, well, did you see them making it? How do you know they made it? And he would say, well, you know, there's a certain degree of complexity there that you don't get, just by itself. You know, so it's a reasonable inference that somebody made it. And I would say, you know, I agree with that logic. But I've got 3 questions for you. Question number 1, can that bird box capture the sun's energy and convert it into useful fuel? No, it can't. Can that bird box repair itself if someone comes up with a pocket knife and takes a piece out of it? No, it can't. Well, can that bird box make copies of itself, which in turn can make copies of themselves, and so on and so on and so on? No, it can't. You know what? The tree, which is holding this bird box, can do all of those things. So if the bird box had a designer, how much more intelligent is the designer of the bird box? That's what I meant. How much? Just checking that you're... I'm very glad you've all got the gift of interpretation. That's very good. Yeah. For those of you who want to get the correct wording on that, we published it in Creation Magazine, and there's an archive version on the web. You know, lots of articles we put in Creation Magazine. There's another plant scientist here tonight, the PhD, Dr. Don Batten, and he had the gall to title an article about the cabbage family, "Eat Your Brussels Sprouts." I suppose I can forgive him for that. But basically, a number of messages from that article, you know, the whole cabbage family comprises things like broccoli or broccoli, depending on how you want to say it, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, of course, kohlrabi, lots of these things. They're all not examples of evolution. They're all part of the same original kind. Cabbages too are in that family. And so it is. Yes. I did 4 years agricultural science degree, and I can tell you they're definitely cabbages. Okay, all right. Okay, that's 3 times interpretation. That's very good. Okay, now, how do we get these new varieties, even new species coming about in the cabbage family? Well, basically, it's just a mixing up of the genes, but occasionally you get some copying mistakes in the genes, and it's not unreasonable to think that things like Brussels sprouts actually came about by mutation in the top bud, that turned off growth there, triggering these side things. I always wanted to tell my mother that Brussels sprouts were mutations. We find lots of examples in the plant world where plant scientists are very eager to name new species that are slightly different from another one. We see that instance in morning glory. Many morning glory plants are blue. We recently had an article about a red mutant. Now, was that an increase in information which would be consistent with evolution from molecules to magnolias? No, it wasn't. It was a downhill loss of information, so there's no joy there for evolutionists. Isn't it interesting though, Morning Glory, what a great name, and design a label. Basically, when you look at the things that God has made, it's quite clear that there was a maker. Consider how the lilies grow. They do not labour or spin, yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his splendour was dressed like one of these. And so we find that the plant world shrieks of a designer and not of evolution. You know, Jesus told a number of parables about plants. One of them was a parable about a mustard seed. Kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of your all your seeds, yet when it grows, it becomes the largest of your garden plants and becomes a tree. Well, you have to know how the language is there. It's not telling us that we're going to get a redwood tree. It's saying we're going to get the largest of your garden plants. And in fact, this is brown mustard, Brassica junkia, and it does grow into being a very large plant from a very tiny seed. That's actually seed of black mustard. Basically, we find lots of examples in the scriptures about plants. There are references to grafting of the wild olive shoot onto the cultivated olive root. And basically it means the wild olive and the cultivated olive are the same kind. Here's Joe Harville again, and he actually likes putting different varieties of citrus onto the one plant. This is one of his favourite mandarin trees. He's also got a tangelo grafted onto that very same tree. And he says, he showed us how he just takes a bud and he says, I don't even need this much material. Just one unspecialised growing cell could efficiently transfer all of the genetic information. Hundreds of books worth of information is transferred so accurately and efficiently that our current technology cannot match it, yet we're being persuaded that this information storage and transmission technology is all due to chance. It's not. When we look at the plant world, we see it fits with what the Bible says. The Bible says that God created different kinds to reproduce according to their kind. In the 5 years I worked as a mango researcher, my colleagues and I must have planted thousands of mango seeds. Every single one that germinated gave rise to a mango. Let the earth bring forth, and it was so, reproducing according to their kind. That there was evening and there was morning the third day. You know, one of the questions I get is how could the creation account be right? Because God made the plants on day 3, but he didn't make the sun until day 4. Well, how could they survive? Well, okay, even if there was a problem, which there wasn't, as we'll see, 6 24-hour days, plants can go without light for 24 hours. But in fact, do you need to have sunlight for plants to grow? Well, no, you don't. And, you know, the state police know full well, you know, from having raided people's bedrooms and finding certain plants in cupboards, that, you know, you don't need sun to grow plants, you just need light. When did God make light? We read that he made it on day 1. You know, evolutionists look at the different family trees and they make the mistake of saying, well, look at all the things in the cabbage family. See, that's sort of evolution, so you can work backwards. And so they try to construct evolutionary family trees. But, you know, it changes all the time. 10 years ago, one very insightful evolutionist, after drawing up some new evolutionary family trees for the plants, said, we're at the stage it looks very simple. As we learn more, we're not going to be so smug. How right is that? It changes and changes and changes. You know, we're privileged later this week to hear a plant geneticist, and I'm sure part of his message will be what he told us, which we published in Creation magazine, that Darwinian evolution is impossible, and geneticists ought to know. Dr. John Sanford, so that's one to look forward to later this week. You know, they try to put together these evolutionary trees, and of late they've started to say, well, maybe it wasn't an evolutionary tree, maybe it was a bush. Do you know, they're getting closer and closer to what we've said all along. It's a creationist orchard. Within each kind, you get the variation as they populate, as they colonise the earth. It fits with the creationist model. You can read more about this in our literature on the website. Now, it's interesting that when God put the man in the garden to tend it, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food, and in the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we've read this passage, you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And how did the woman answer the serpent? She said, well, we mustn't touch it. Well, we've looked at that. But when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, you know, she was quite a scientist, because that matched indeed what God said he had done. When she saw it was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and in her eyes desirable for gaining wisdom, she ate it and she gave some to her husband, and we're still living with the consequences today. So the evolutionists are right about seeing big changes in the world, but we trace them back to this big event that happened back in the early chapters of Genesis. And we find in that one of the consequences was that the ground would be cursed through painful toil. He'd have to eat of it all the days of his life, and that it would produce thorns and thistles. So we went from being a horticulture-only privileged man to being banished from the garden and now having to till the soil. And so we've gone from horticulture to agriculture. And so we've got wheat and barley and rice that we have to grow, and we've now got thorns. And we've got thorns in abundance. By the way, people who say, well, God could have done it over millions of years, have got some problems, because if you accept the secular dating of thorns, then what have you got? You've got Adam and Eve in the garden, a very good creation. There they are with all the animals. There's no death in the world, but it's very good, as God said. But if you believe in the millions of years, well, you get that from the fossil record. And what do you find in the fossil record? You find death, bloodshed. Well, oh yes, I know what I was going to say here. Plants are not living creatures in the sense that animals are. The Hebrew is nephesh chaya, okay? That is never applied to plants or to invertebrates. And so it was okay for the plants to be eaten. They didn't die. The Bible speaks of plants withering. But when it comes to animal death, animal suffering, animal disease, then we find that right throughout the fossil record. How long? 1 minute. Wow, that's a challenge. Okay. Thorns we find in the fossil record, and if you accept the evolutionary dating, they're 400 million years old. So look, you just can't do that. I'll see if I can find here my finish up slide, seeing I'm giving a widen up signal. We find, by the way, the fossil record doesn't match the evolutionists. We find lots of examples of plants being living fossils. Coal forests fit with having been buried rapidly. Similarly with amber fossils. Lots of stuff here. You'll have to go to the website to read up on this. We find examples where the land has been denuded, like at Mount St Helens and at Surtsey Island. The plants are recolonising it very, very rapidly indeed. And so they've had to throw all of their ecology ideas out the window. Ascension Island, for example, in New Scientist, they said that basically in just 150 years from things that some of the sailors brought in, they managed to get a fully functioning rainforest. And it says here, discovering this cloud forest on Ascension Island is like finding that a pile of used car parts in a scrapyard has spontaneously reassembled into a functioning car. Unless that is, ecologists have got their theories hopelessly wrong. That's very interesting, isn't it? Please go just 1 more minute, if I could. Can I have 1 more minute? Yes. Emotional manipulation, says Gary. I'm sure this bit will be edited out of the DVD. Look, one of the campers here today took time out to draw me a couple of pictures, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't put them up. And basically it's in this context. Plants have been discovered in the Northern Hemisphere which have, as part of their flowering mechanism, a built-in catapult, and they can hurtle the pollen into the air in the same way that a trebuchet catapult does. And the difficulty for evolutionists is you need all the different pieces there to be at once, otherwise it just doesn't work. Now the thing about the big trebuchet, it can actually hurl big weights, and in fact in medieval times, sometimes a castle under siege would send out a messenger to the army that kept hurtling missiles and try and negotiate for peace. And sometimes that army didn't like what the messenger said, and they would throw him back talk about shooting the messenger. And in fact, we find an example of that in one of Jesus' parables. He talks about how the owner of the vineyard sent a whole lot of messengers, they got killed, then he sent his son, and his son too got killed. Jesus was, of course, referring to himself. When we look at Jesus' death on the cross, it is very poignant indeed, because what did he have on his head? A twisted crown of thorns. In other words, he bore on his head the result of the curse. You know, there's lots of parables that Jesus talked about. I'd like to finish with this one here, if I might, the parable of the tares. You remember the parable of the tares? You remember that one? Yes. Okay. Do you want us then to go and rip them up? And no, lest while you rip up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let us grow both together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest I'll say to the reapers, gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. I heard a pastor say once, you know one reason why I think God said to leave the tares be until the harvest? Because God is a master at turning tares into wheat. That was certainly the case for me. I was once a weed, I was once a tare, but now God calls those of us who have received him to be merciful to those who doubt, snatch others from the fire and save them. It's tempting to think of some people who are hard as being autumn trees without fruit and uprooted, impossible to reach out to, but we read this. We might plant the seed and someone else waters it, but it's God that makes it grow, though we know not how. Let's go out and do that.